But tonight's speaker, Jesse Kraft, colleague of mine here at the ANS. Jesse received his PhD in history from the University of Delaware in 2019. And before that, Jesse, in fact, was an intern here at the ANS, which is how we got to know him, and subsequently a ANS summer seminar student in 2017. Jesse was hired at the ANS after he finished his PhD in 2019 and is now the curator of American Numismatics, where he oversees the coins, tokens, medals, and so forth of the Americas, Northern and Southern Hemisphere. Jesse is a cultural historian and a numismatist, and he has published extensively on a number of topics ranging from site-specific inquiries to global impacts of the United States, Latin American and Atlantic trade. He's done a significant amount of historical analysis on numismatics, published in early American numismatics, published in the Journal of Early American Numismatics, Gene. And he also, something which I'm sure is the bane of his existence at the moment, he is responsible for overseeing the purchase that the American Numismatic Society did in 2018 of the MidAtlantic Art Company archives. They are, most of these 100,000 objects that we purchased in 2018 are now stored in a warehouse in Brooklyn, and Jesse spends a day a week out in Brooklyn trying to sort through all of this and make sense of all of it. So hats off to Jesse for that. But tonight, his Money Talks lecture derives from a chapter in his dissertation, which was entitled The Circulation of Foreign Coinage, an American Response, circa 1750 to 1857. And he is currently at the moment revising that manuscript to publish as a book sometime before the end of this year. So Jesse, all yours.
Peter, thank you. Welcome to the ANS Money Talks. As Peter mentioned, the first hybrid event. This is also the first that's offered on a weekday. This is usually a Saturday afternoon event. Today I'll be giving the talk, Fips, Levies, Shillings, and Dollars, Language, Value, and the Circulation of Spanish-American Small Change in the Early United States. The fact that I'm discussing money and language at an event called Money Talks has not gone unnoticed. I'm going to start off with what is language? Language, while many species in the animal kingdom are able to communicate amongst each other, language as we know it is a phenomenon that is unique to human beings. Though no one knows for certain, estimates range from 5,000 to 7,500 languages currently in use, with many more that have come and gone. Language has many functions. One is a tool for communication. At its core, language is a structured system of communication that is reliant on both vocabulary and grammar. Most languages have multiple means of conveyance, whether through the spoken word, through signs and gestures, or through the written text. Language is a learned function that allows for social conventions to exist within a given society. Here on the right, we could see a 2nd century mural from the Teotihuacan culture, which is a dominant society of the pre-Columbian Mexico, or what is now Mexico, and was located about 40 miles north of where Mexico City now stands. And it shows a figure emitting a speech scroll, symbolizing language. Language is also a tool for expression and expressive thought. It allows for the creation of complex ideas and expressions that can even be independent of both grammar and vocabulary, as exemplified through this poem, written in January 1939 by famed poet E.E. Cummings. Either way, language is not static. As a learned function that allows for social convention, it can change over both time and space. As a room full of numismatists, it's not completely necessary to define money, but since I just provided a definition for language, a concept that most of us use on a daily basis, I would be remiss if I did not. Money is an item that is accepted as a payment for goods and services. The 3 main functions of money allow for it to act as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Some historians and economists have expanded the number of functions to many times to as many as 6, but all of them offer at least these 3 main functions, so I'll stick with them. For numismatists, money is generally considered to be coins, paper currency, and sometimes tokens that offer some sort of redemptive value. With those two definitions for language and money, we can continue. What are others saying about language and money? Here I have three statements, two of which I don't necessarily agree with, while the third, in my opinion, nails it. Adam Richards and Jeremy Nichols state that, quote, "The promise of accounting is that it provides an intuitive measure that is universally understood, currency. Across cultures, currency gives us a measure of value and exchange. While it can be argued that this statement means that all cultures have currency, even though this is not wholly true, and to claim that it is intuitive measure negates the fact that the understanding of money is a completely taught phenomenon. In short, currency cannot be used as a measure from one culture to the next without a common language." Next, Annie Radin, Martin Loosemore, and Andrew King state that, quote, "Money is a common language and currency everyone in business and government understands," end quote. Regardless of your personal thoughts on business and governmental figures, the statement considers money as the common language to allow for trade, rather than the fact that it is a common language that it allows money to circulate in trade. Lastly, Felix Martin has it correct when he states that, quote, "Successful negotiation requires a common language, a shared idea of what words mean. For markets to function, there needs to be a shared concept of value and standardized units in which to measure it," end quote. It is with that sentiment that guides the rest of this presentation. As we will see, a common language is needed for money to circulate properly within a given economy. This does not necessarily require that everyone within an economy to speak the same language on a day-to-day basis. Rather, that key words related to the money in use need to be understood in order for languages to be properly conveyed. In cases when foreign coinages are used, such as the majority in colonial America, this can result in the creation of completely different names than were used in the place of origin. I'm going to give you some very brief histories and definitions of coins under discussion, focusing on their original names and or their etymologies. First, the Spanish dollar. This coin was first minted in Spain under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, beginning in 1497. With the discovery of large amounts of silver in the Spanish colonies in America, a royal decree allowed for a mint to open in Mexico City in 1535, and the first coins issuing the following year. This relatively large silver coin was divisible into 8 reales, hence the name Real de a Ocho, meaning 8 royals, in English as real translate into royal. This coin was also called a peso, meaning weight, with full names of peso duro, meaning hard weight, or peso fuerte, meaning strong weight. It is from these names that the colloquial term pieces of 8 was introduced in the Anglophonic world, a term that is often used today when referring to these coins. The basis for the dollar came after the 8 reales coin. Early in the 16th century, large amounts of silver deposits were discovered in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is largely governed by the Holy Roman Empire. Silver was already known in this area, but the size of these discoveries was unprecedented. At the time, the exportation of silver was prohibited and resulted in large amounts of silver being illegally exported from the kingdom for purposes of trade. With the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in 1519, a compromise was finally made, leading to the legal exportation of struck coins. In 1520, the first coins were struck in Johannesthal. From that, the suffix er was added to the name, meaning of or from Johannesthal in German. The German language has an interesting tendency of sometimes cutting down certain words in specific cases. Perhaps the most well-known is the case of burger, which derives from many types of sausages that are native to given towns throughout the region, such as hamburger from Hamburg, Nuremberger from Nuremberg, and so on. Similarly, the Johannesthal was quickly shortened to thaler, literally meaning of the valley. The popularity of this coin in trade allowed for other types of thalers as well, notably the Rijksdaler and the Albertusdaler, the latter of which is the famed Dutch lion thaler, that actually saw some usage in New Amsterdam, what is now New York. With this common name, the circulation and relative value may have diminished. By the 1560s, Spanish-American silver was imported into Europe in large quantities, sometimes through Spain, while other pieces entered the continent via other means. The earliest known usage of dollar dates to about 1581, but this likely only referred to the thalers of continental Europe. The earliest mention that I could find of Spanish dollars was from 1677, though earlier references may be out there. To the right, we can see a money chart from 1699 that clearly still makes the distinction between dollars and reals, the latter spelled R-Y-A-L-S, with all referring to dollars, referring to the Germanic coins, and reals referring to the Spanish coins. Here we can see the highlighted term Spanish dollar, which was then further defined as real of 8/1. This coming from the Merchant's Map of Commerce by Robert Slew in 1677. That's the earliest use of Spanish dollar that I was able to find so far. Aside from Spanish and continental European dollar-sized coins, British coins play a large part in this story, as it is largely the names of these coins that are applied to the Spanish-American dollars once they were in heavy usage in the British colonies. In the British pound sterling, which dates back to about 800 CE, largely revolves around the idea that 1 pound equals 20 shillings and 1 shilling equals 12 pence, or that 1 pound equals 240 pence, as seen to the right. In the main body of the slide, I provide a brief etymology of these terms to show that they themselves did not derive from nowhere, but were derivative from earlier terms to help aid in their circulation, much like the rest of the coins in this presentation. The British term pound comes from the Old English pund, and from the Germanic pfund before that. Its root dates back to the libra pondo, which denoted a Roman pound weight of 12 ounces. The British shilling is from the Old English skilling, literally meaning 1/20th of a pound, and this being the value that it continued to hold for hundreds of years thereafter. Skilling derives from the Proto-Germanic skiliania, meaning to separate, split, or divide, and dates from around the early 7th century. Finally, penny is from the Old English word penig and has roots in the Proto-Germanic word peninga. Through trade and immigration, Spanish-American coinage began to enter British colonies in North America in the early 17th century. Because it was British leaders and subjects who governed the colonies, these coins were then valued into British monetary terms of shillings and pence. For a number of reasons that largely revolved around scarcity and a desire to keep what coins that entered the colonies from leaving the colonies, these coins were often given much higher value than those in England. In the motherland, for example, a Spanish dollar was evaluated at 4 shillings 6 pence. Meanwhile, an ordinance in New York from 1675 gave these coins a value of 6 shillings and 6 pence, while in the MidAtlantic states, they were valued at 5 shillings, all of which were higher than those in Britain. Beginning in 1690 Massachusetts, however, and spreading throughout the different colonies in the early 18th century, paper currency was introduced, often in large quantities, and upset these values even further. This paper currency quickly overtook the defining quality of the values between dollar and shilling, since the paper currency was denominated in shillings and pence, while the dominant hard currency remained to be Spanish dollar, or the fractions thereof. It must be remembered that from this point forward, whenever a value is given in pound, shilling, or pence in North America, they are no longer talking about the British pound sterling, but about individual colonial monetary systems that were independent of both the motherland and of each other. Much like there is a US dollar, a Canadian dollar, a Jamaican dollar, and a Hong Kong dollar, and so on, there were separate monetary systems that existed in different regions or colonies. Leading up to the American Revolution, the ratios between the Spanish dollars and the various colonial systems had settled, no longer heavily affected by inflation, with the exception of South Carolina, which still faced heavy ups and downs, and also during the Revolution itself, when everything saw inflationary measures. However, this chart shows the basic differences between the shilling systems under normal circumstances, along with their equivalents under the United States decimal system, as these names existed well into the 19th century. It should be noted that despite using names, albeit with different values, a dollar was still a dollar. Something that was sold for 6 shillings in Connecticut would be sold for 8 shillings in New York. They did not mean that the person actually paid more money for that. The person from New York would not save money if they traveled to Connecticut to purchase the same item, as a conversion between the two sums both equaled a dollar. Rather, this system affected how the dollar was subdivided into fractions rather than how objects were priced in multiples. The 1 real and half real coins were by far the most prevalent silver coinage in the late colonial period up to the 1850s in the United States. The nation simply did not have the natural reserves to supply the nation with coinage, as they were either just beginning to be or yet to have been discovered. In fact, most of the silver coinage struck by the U.S. Mint up to that point was melted down Spanish-American coinage or other foreign silver coins. While these coins were in circulation, different regions had different names for them, largely based on the respective state shilling pence systems. Here is a good quote from the historian Israel Ward Andrews, who said in 1886 that, quote, "The 4 pence, the 9 pence, the picayune, the shilling, the 6 pence, the fip, and the levy. These the reader would naturally understand to be 7 different coins, whereas the 7 were in fact only 2, with various names. 30 years prior, the Evening Star made a passing comment on these piecings that, in fact, every locality had a separate epithet for the smooth-faced little joker. Smooth-faced because by that time most of these coins were rather worn down from decades of circulation." Here are 2 instances where the regional variations in value had confounded the people trying to use them. First from the Polynesian, which is a Honolulu newspaper, but it was actually from the Knickerbocker from New York. So, how much did you say it was? 3 and 6 pence, asked the lady. 4 and 6 pence, if you please, ma'am, said the driver. Oh, 4 and 6 pence. And after a good deal of fumbling and shaking of her pockets, she at last produced a $half and a York shilling and put them into the driver's hand. "That is not enough, ma'am," said the driver. "I want 9 pence more." "What, ain't we in York State?" she asked eagerly. "No, ma'am," replied the driver. "It is 6 shillings York money." "Well," said the lady, "I used to be quite good at reckoning when I was at home in the state of New Hampshire. I've reckoned up many a fish voyage, but since I've got so far from home, I believe I'm beginning to lose my mental faculties." In this case, the York shilling mentioned would be a Spanish-American 1 real coin valued at 12.5 cents. Second one is a Frenchman who's visiting in the United States. "How much is it?" 3 shillings, sir." "Very well, here's the money," handing the waiter a $half. "There's your change," said the waiter. "Diable, change? I thought you said 3 shilling." "Yes, sir, and there's your shilling and change." Turning to Mr. Reed, who happened to sit next to him, the Frenchman said, "What does the man mean by calling this 1 shilling and the change for $half?" "It is all right, sir," said Mr. Reed. The dinner cost 3 York shillings, and that is your right change." "York shilling? What sort of shilling is that?" "Beggar, this is one strange country. Every place I go, new kind of money. In Canada, 3 shilling is 60 cents. In Vermont, 3 shilling is 50 cents. Here, 3 shilling is 37 cents. By and by, 3 shilling be 1 cent, I think." "Shillings and pence do make rather a troublesome kind of currency," said Mr. Reed. But you have to now got to the lowest value of the shilling. As you got further south, you will find it continually rise, till in South Carolina and Georgia it is still higher than in Canada. But shillings and pence are not the currency of the United States. These names for the coins were also subject to contractions, which are shortened versions of a spoken and written form of word, syllable, or word group created by the omission of internal letters or sounds. Many historians claim that contractions first date from this period, when in fact they are found in Old English and date back to as early as 7th century CE. There's an extensive history of contractions found in monetary usage. Here are 2 instances of contractions found in colloquial speech of New England relating to shillings and pence. In New England, 1 shilling equaled 1/6 of a dollar, or 16.7 cents. However, the 1 real coin was still worth 1/8 of a dollar, or 12.5 cents, which in New England money equated to just under 9 pence. Rounding up, the 1 real coin was known as a 9 pence, or 9pence, when speaking, whereas, as we saw, this coin was known as a York shilling in New York. Similarly, the half real was known as a 4pence halfpenny. In the MidAtlantic region, which includes New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, the dollar was broken up into 7.5 shillings, or 13.33 cents. With the 1 real coin still worth 12.5 cents, it equated to 11.3 pence in this currency. Therefore, the 1 real coin was known as an 11-penny bit, but was nearly always shortened to levy. Similarly, the half real was a 5-penny pint, and sometimes shortened to a 50 bit, but almost always just a fip. Fips and levies were extremely common terms for consumers to hear throughout the 19th century in this region. As we can see from the arithmetic book from 1850 named The Little Federal Calculator, we can see that this was common knowledge that people were expected to know in order to be proficient in day-to-day reckoning. If you look at numbers 359 and 360, in particular, these terms are mentioned and defined. Number 359 says, what is the 12.5 cent piece called in Pennsylvania and some other states? 11 pence bit, or 11 penny bit, or levy. In 360, what is the 6 1/4 cent piece called? 5 pence, penny bit, or fip. Numbers 361, 62, and 63, we can see what people may expect should they have to travel to neighboring states. 361, when a boy from New England goes to New York, what will his 9 pences and 4 pences be called here? If he should go to Philadelphia, what would they be called there? If he should bring away with him any levies, New York shillings, and fips, what would they pass for in his own town? What now appears to be different names in our country for the 12-cent bits? The answer would be 9 pences, 11 penny bits, or levies, and shilling pieces. What are the different names for the 6 1/4 pieces? The answer, 4 pence halfpennies, or 4 pences, 6 pence, and fips, and fippenny bits. As you can see, when you travel from state to state, it can get rather confusing. And this was the norm. This wasn't anywhere out of the ordinary. The penny. This is one British term that was used in the 19th century during the state shilling pence systems that is still with us today. Sometimes in today's news, I'll come across articles about how the U.S. does not use pennies, but cents, and that pennies are only used in Britain. While yes, this may be somewhat true, there is a history behind this term that is far more complicated than simply calling cents pennies just because of the copper coin of this country. As you should now be able to figure out, when someone uses the term penny, they're not talking about a British coin, rather hearkening back to the New York shillings. While 12 pence equal 1 shilling in New York, 12.5 cents equaled 1 shilling. Therefore, 1 New York penny was worth 1.04 cents, a sum that was impossible to calculate in reality. Therefore, the 1 cent piece became known as a penny, relative to its value of a New York shilling rather than any relation to the British penny. So the next time that someone reminds you that we don't use pennies and that you shouldn't use the term because we're not British, you can let them know that you're talking about New York pennies instead. Spanish American coins were not the only foreign coinage to circulate in the United States, while they were the most often encountered. Another popular coin was from Brazil, and was one of the most encountered gold coins in the region from about the early 1700s until about 1800, 1820, when Portugal lost control of Brazil and gold production plummeted to quite a degree. Until the mid-18th century, the dominant Brazilian coin was the moeda de oro, valued at 4,000 reis. However, if you said any of that to a colonist in North America, they would have no idea what you were referring to. Very, very few people knew how to speak Portuguese in this area and didn't know how much a reis was. So they anglicized it to moidor, which you can see is the contraction of the Portuguese term. After mid-century, another series of Brazilian coins began to appear in earnest, the 12,800 reis and the 6,400 reis gold coins. Again, since nobody knew the value of a reis, it would not have otherwise circulated without a name change. To make things simple, all the colonists did was take the first few letters of the monarch's name, which coincidentally happened to be both Joe, despite a change in leadership, and use them to name the coin. Therefore, you have the Joe and the half Joe coins. This particular piece that we see here is a half Joe that, without a doubt, circulated in both Boston and New York, as the punch mark of Boston goldsmith Thomas Pons can be found on the center of the reverse, while that of New York goldsmith Ephraim Brasher is on the neck of the obverse. This here is an entry from an account book of Philadelphia goldsmith Thomas Shields. In this single transaction, Shields paid Joseph Sturgis in Brazilian half-joes, which he used the full name Johannes name, a large amount of Spanish-American dollars, a French crown, the crown also being a British term that was used for both British and French large silver coins, British shillings and gold guineas. This single entry represents a microcosm of the hard money supply in Philadelphia during the Revolution. Notice that the dollars here are trading for 11 shilling 3 pence rather than the 7 shilling 6 pence as noted earlier. This was due to revolutionary inflation, to which all the coins here were affected by. I think this entry dates from December 19th of 1776, so just as things were really getting heated up. In creating the United States dollar, a fair amount of debate occurred, most notably between Robert Morris, known as the financier of the Revolution, and Thomas Jefferson. Morris was the first to propose a monetary system for this nation. While Morris understood that in order that a coin may be perfectly intelligible to the whole people, it must have some affinity to the former currency. He took this to the extreme, and then some. As you will see, it got confusing. Morris found that the common denominator for all the various state shilling pence system then in use was 1,440. With that, he divided the Spanish dollar into that number and created a system from there. He also noticed that this small amount was practically equivalent to 1/4 grain of silver, so he called this small sum a quarter. He then proposed that 1,000 quarters equal 1 US pound, 100 quarters equal 1 US shilling, and 10 quarters equal a US penny. It does make sense to us today because a quarter means something completely different. However, in this proposal, he did not make the physical coins equal into these units. He himself stated that there was, quote, no necessity that this money unit be exactly represented in coin, end quote, as seen to the right. Instead, he created the crown, half-crown, dollar, shilling, groat, and quarter coins, none of which equated to the pound, shilling, or penny, and none of which equated to the coins already existing in circulation with those names. The US dollar, for instance, would have been about 1/5 the size of the Spanish-American dollar, despite using the same name. This system would have been a complete and utter disaster by simply complicating matters even worse. So he went back to the drawing board and came up with another proposal. This is the one that most US numismatists are aware of, as some experimental coins were actually struck in the process. With this, he began to accept the decimal system. This plan consisted of the mark, quint, cent, 8, and 5, valued at 1,000, 500, 100, 8, and 5 quarters respectively. Today, these quarters are often called units rather than quarters, though Morris himself used the latter term. This was still rather cumbersome. To purchase a horse, for example, which averaged about $80 at this time, the sum would have run into the 6 figures under this plan. Jefferson didn't like either of Morris's plan. His major problem was one of language. In objection to the Morris plan, he noted that it, quote, "It is difficult to familiarize a new coin to the people. It is more difficult to familiarize them with a new coin with an old name." In May of 1784, he gave 3 prerequisites of a successful circulating coin. One of convenient size, not too big, not too small, that its parts or multiples are easily in proportion to one another, and that, most importantly to us, the coins are, quote, "so nearly of the value of some of the known coins as they may be of easy adoption by the people. The Spanish dollar seems to fulfill all these conditions," end quote. With that, he took away the shillings, pence, fips, levies, and bits, and based a completely new system off the Spanish-American dollar alone, where one eagle equaled $10, $1 equaled 10 dimes, 10 dimes 10 cents, and 1 cent 10 mills. Even still, as Jefferson's comment about the difficulty of introducing a new coin to the populace predicted, the state, shilling, and pence system continued for generations thereafter, as already alluded to in this presentation. In some of the more rural areas of Pennsylvania, for instance, I was able to find reports of Fips and levies being used right up until the First World War. In conclusion, this presentation shows the importance of a common language in understanding the value of money on a day-to-day basis. In colonial America, if coins circulated under their given names, such as Real de a Ocho or 12,800 reis, no one would have understood their value relative to the units of account then in use. Despite the common language, we found that things still became conflated due to regional variations in value. Jefferson tried to alleviate this in the creation of the federal dollar, and instead of creating an entirely new base coin, he used the Spanish-American dollar and created practical names for the multiples and subdivisions of that coin. Today, we are very familiar with the dollar, the dime, and the cent, or should I say the penny. But this was not always the case. Regardless of the system in use, a common language holds it all together. Thank you. Any comments, questions?
And also, since I'm asking the question first, I don't think that people can hear me out there, so if you can repeat whatever people ask you, just for the sake of the people outdoors.
Okay.
Could you speak to the word eagle that Jefferson proposes? Is it just because of the bird, or was that used previously in some capacity monetarily?
Yeah, the question was the word eagle for the $10 gold piece, was that used previously or not? And it was not. That was a completely new creation on Jefferson's part. Dime and cent have French origins before that. But yeah, the eagle was a completely new American coin and term.
For the bird.
Absolutely. Yep. Yes?
What is the earliest usage of the spelling for dime, D-I-M-E?
I was able to find it in the 1830s, and I've seen both. I've seen D-I-S-M-E, deem as it's pronounced, used up to the 1830s as well.
Yeah.
And I've even found it's actually more often than not, whenever the word dime, regardless of spelling, was used, it was often accompanied with a definition, because Fips and levies were so much in use that people really didn't know what a dime was. So even though it was the federal currency, part of the monetary system for decades at that point, people didn't know what it was. And yeah, it had to be defined pretty much every time. Thank you. Yes?
How does the term bit fit into this?
Bits, I'm not 100% certain where the etymology of that comes from. Right, yeah. I mean, when you divide it up, I'm sure it's just, a bit of something. Then there's also one that I didn't go over, which is more of a southern term, is picayune. And I think that there are even some, I know that there's a newspaper down in Louisiana named Picayune after this. Exactly, yeah. So yeah, I think just dividing it up into bits, perhaps, yeah, so just a colloquial term, absolutely.
In the creation of monetary systems, there's always a tremendous amount of tension between the state, which tries to coerce people into using whatever units of account and valuations and so forth that it decrees, and the market, which will decide whether or not to accept whatever the state is trying to codify or decree or whatever. So in this case, where you have a unit of account, which, if I understand this, was essentially the dollar, which was then subdivided into various shillings depending on what state you were in. Were these subdivisions of the dollar in these various states, were these codified in any way, or was this essentially just market valuations that had been determined somehow and accepted?
Yeah, the question is were these state shilling pence systems codified in any way? And that they were, absolutely. In colonial times, they were because of their namesake of the British system. But yeah, in New Hampshire, actually, they, according to their constitution, used the word shilling as their primary monetary unit of value until 1950. So, and there was a referendum, and it just barely passed. So, it's like 52% of the people said, yeah, let's get rid of the shilling and start using dollars and cents. Of course, in practice, that was already long gone, but constitutionally and according to their codes, they still used shillings and pence until 1950. And
in one of your earlier slides, too, you illustrated how the pound in the colonies was overvalued, or the Spanish peso was overvalued in the colonies vis-a-vis the peso in the United Kingdom, or England, I guess, at that point. How was that enforced?
Well, I mean, the same way that any law is enforced, really. I mean, you can write something down, and whether it's enforced or not is one thing. I'm sure that there are cases of when it traded outside of those. In fact, inflationary measures go against those codes, and every time that there's a war or something like that inflation happens, they don't necessarily change the laws, but in practice these values are being changed. And yeah, I mentioned that the reason for that was to kind of keep the coins in the colony, and so even with those laws, I mean, they could very easily escape the colony, if at any given point.
In all of your research, have you ever run across a case where somebody was accused, tried, convicted of not accepting money at whatever value the state had decreed, or anything of that sort?
No, not necessarily. Not. Yeah.
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
The question was whether or not individuals were ever punished legally for not accepting currency at its given rate by law, and I've not found any cases of that happening. It may have happened, but I don't think that it was necessarily enforced to that degree. I think it was more of a kind of a legal thing to kind of keep the coins in, and oftentimes not only to keep them in, but also attract people to bring them in.
Question. With this divergence of exchange between the British system and the dollar, between the states, was this something that primarily just came about because of the issuance of paper? I would think that if one presented a silver British coin of a given denomination, that would command a value that would remain constant in relation to Spanish silver.
Yes and no, but again, I mean, it all depends on kind of what's happening. Not only does it depend on, the question was, whether or not, can you, I'm sorry, can you?
The circulation of, the
I think we actually
circulation
have
of,
a mic now, sorry. We'll see if that works.
the circulation of British coinage might
Right.
have been scanty.
Mm-hmm.
And so the notion or the concept of a shilling or fractions of a shilling would be more related to the currency that was in circulation and that was more inflationary. But if you actually had variable conversion rates between silver shillings and silver dollars between the colonies, wouldn't that create the potential for endless arbitrage to take place in exchange across state lines?
Yeah, sure. But
There weren't conversion. It wasn't silver shillings that had the different conversion rates. It was shillings of account, which
Right.
were different from silver shillings. A silver shilling was always a silver shilling, but it would be worth more than 1 shilling in New York money, for example.
just
New
like
York
how
paper money.
in New York
What,
money of account.
if you wish to redeem your money of account to
Um,
something you could put in your pocket?
Yeah, then you could redeem it in Spanish reales or English sixpences or anything else that might be circulating.
So then there was the possibility for this kind of cross-border exchange if one wished to engage in it.
You wouldn't necessarily gain money by taking currency from one colony to the next because a dollar was worth a dollar, but it's how it's subdivided rather than multiplied. So if you had a dollar in one colony that was worth 6 shillings, and if you took it to a colony that was worth 8 shillings, you wouldn't necessarily gain 33% value. You would still have a dollar, essentially. And in this case, you would still have a silver shilling. It would be worth more or less on paper, but so even if you're talking about shillings in New Jersey currency and you try to exchange it for British shillings, it would be a completely different value that you would get. Kind of the same where I was talking about the difference between Canadian dollars and US dollars. If you go across, you're not going to necessarily gain more money. It'll be a different number, but you're not necessarily more or less rich because when you cross that border again, you are going to trade it for the same amount. And when you try and purchase something, it's not going to be the same number of shillings. It's going to be a different number of shillings, but it's going to be the same value in relative terms to each other.
Well, I guess maybe I'm being totally dense, but I have a dollar in New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
and I exchange it for 8 shillings because that's what I don't remember the numbers you put up. Let's say that's what it gets me in New Jersey. I take those 8 shillings and I go to another state where that gets me $1.1, and then I cross back over and I re-exchange. It just seems to be the
Yeah, a silver shilling isn't worth a shilling of account. That's the thing, is that all the
Oh,
colonies.
that's okay, that's what I was asking.
Right.
The shillings of account and the shillings are two separate.
Exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
An
Separate
English
kinds
shilling
of.
and a New York shilling are different units of money.
Right. Yeah.
So we agree that we're using shillings of account within every state that we are conducting
Right,
business.
and an English shilling has to be like mentally exchanged into New York shillings to be used in New York.
So another question, in New Orleans, did they use soup, and how is that related to the penny?
But I mean that's just another
A synonym for.
exactly and just another copper coin that had a different value and would be exchanged using conversion methods just like any other coin.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Jesse, it looks like Ben has put up a question on the screen.
From Dan Friedis, despite already being part of the U.S., there are 20th century tokens from Arizona and New Mexico denominated in 6 1/4 and 12 1/2 cents. Since people there were still thinking in reales. Yeah, absolutely. That's very true, and that happened well until after the Civil War. We actually have tokens from New York City that were issued in the 1850s that were denominated in shillings and pence that were relative to the Spanish American currency rather than any United States dollar that was circulating at the time. So yeah, it's an absolutely good.
Jesse, how long did it take for shillings and pence to die out?
It all depends on the region, and even within the region, the question was how long did it take for shillings and pence to die out? Not only regionally, but also there is a divide between urban and rural as well. Really, by the Civil War, shillings and pence were starting to die out in urban regions, whereas some places up until the First World War in more rural places. The peak of their usage was really the 1830s and 1840s is when you really see it. And almost in every single account book all throughout the country, you'll see things denominated in shillings and pence and being sold that way. Dan Friedis has their hand up. Would you like to say anything more, Dan, or was your one statement that? I think you're on mute, or I'm on mute.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you, Dan.
Okay. Could you say something, unlike Robert Morris's hypothetical, into 10 segments. Could you speak about the real but short-lived practice in the 1790s of doing accounting in 90th? So
Right, yeah.
opposed to cent.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of gets complicated, but I mean, a dollar was divided into 90ths for a short amount of time, and this relates to the Articles of Confederation and the copper coinage that was then in use, where a lot of the state coppers were kind of set up to be 1/90th of a dollar rather than 100th of a dollar that we're used to. Yeah, it gets a little complicated as far as that goes, but yeah, it's this pre-federal money that kind of is the 90th of a dollar, as far as according to my understanding of it.
Although the practice, the documents that I've seen after the mint was in existence, so the cent in theory should have become the unit of like, even cent coin early. It weren't in everyone's pocket yet.
Yeah, you're kind of cutting in and out, but I think that you mentioned that it's happening also after the federal coinage is introduced. But just because,
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Right, that's what documents that I've seen have all been from the 1790s.
Right. I mean, just because once a law is passed, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone changes their ways. I mean, as we have seen, once the Coinage Act of 1792 is passed, these, even pre-Articles of Confederation terms are still being used well into the 1850s. So I think that their origins date to like the late 1780s and into the 1790s, prior to the Mint Act of 1792. But I mean, people are still using them into the 1790s, despite the fact that this legal change had occurred. It's hard to change people's practices with a simple stroke of the pen. Things still happen socially for quite a while. Any other questions, comments? I think that might do it for us.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
There's a hand up.
This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society. Since 1858, the ANS has supported research and education in numismatics and the history of money. With a collection of over 800,000 objects, an extensive library, a dynamic publishing arm, and ever-improving online research resources, we have become one of the largest numismatic institutions in the world. If you wish to support the ANS and the work we do, you can join as a member and become a part of this historic community. Go to numismatics.org/membership to see options and prices.